I'm Renzo. I'm currently a fourth year Atlas student, and I'm working on my bachelor thesis on self-directed learning in Atlas, and specifically on the PDP and SER part of that. And today I'll be telling a bit more about it. So I didn't join the course that Mika hosted, but I was indeed asked by Leon to join. So let's get into it. Today I will be talking about four topics. First, I shortly want to reintroduce the Atlas profile according to its core values. Then I want to discuss self-directed learning. And then I'll share a bit of my first observations that I'm gathering from my data on my research. And then I'll tell a little bit more about my bachelor thesis. So starting with the Atlas core values, when you read the Atlas SER that was made for the accreditation report in 2018, there are 5 core values very clearly stipulated. Starting off with self-directed learning, which is pretty straightforward after I've made my explanation. Then integration focuses on combining all the disciplines in the academic world. Excellence is something we strive for, as Olaf already mentioned. And then we are coming to community. We're doing all of this in a community. We are a learning community. In the end, we're also doing it for the community, be it our own, be it bigger, or be it even worldwide. And then the 5th point is trailblazing. We Atlas students strive to go to things, achieve things that have not been achieved before. And that's what trailblazing also stands for. So when moving on to self-directed learning, we've got a definition proposed by Knowles in 1975, so almost 50 years ago, which is still widely accepted as the definition for self-directed learning. I'll quickly read it out loud. In its broadest meaning, self-directed learning describes a process in which individuals take the initiative with or without the help of others in diagnosing their learning needs, formulating learning goals, identifying human and material resources for learning, choosing and implementing appropriate learning strategies, and evaluating learning outcomes. When looking at this process, and also when reading the rest of his booklet on self-directed learning, you find out that there are 2 more activities to the process of self-directed learning, which is first of all planning of your journey, and second of all monitoring of your process. So as you can see on here, I visualized it as a cycle, because self-directed learning is something you do in an iterative process. You go through the cycle again and again and again and improve yourself in that way. Then indeed moving on to activities. The first one is identifying your learning outcomes, which pretty much is figuring out your ideal situation where you want to be at compared to where you're currently at now. And I think Marijn visualized it quite nicely with her explanation. So you can imagine that the red dot is your ultimate goal, and the blue circle that you are with your own knowledge and capabilities where you're currently at. And the distance between the two are your learning needs. Then the second activity is formulating your learning goals, which is figuring out what goals you need to achieve in order to decrease the gap, decrease your learning needs. And then we move on to identifying the human and material resources, which seems pretty straightforward. You figure out who can help you in achieving the goals, how you can achieve those, what you need for those. And then the 4th activity is choosing the appropriate learning strategies, which is pretty much choosing how you're going to learn, how you're going to use the resources, and what steps you're going to be taking in the process. And then, of course, you write it down in your planning phase. You make a concrete plan of approach, how you're going to do all these things, and how you're going to achieve it. And then you're going to start learning. You're going to start implementing your learning goals. You're going to implement your learning strategies and start working on it. Then in step 7, you're going to monitor your process, see what steps you've taken, if you're still going to on the trajectory to reach your learning goals. And then in the end, step 8, you're going to evaluate your learning outcomes, so the results you've gotten throughout the phases. And then once you've done that, you already got more information to, again, identify your learning needs. When looking at all these activities, you can pretty much divide them in 4 different phases, which is basically based on their purpose. So in the first phase, you need to focus on what you're going to learn, what you need to learn. Second phase is what are you going to use to learn, how you're going to do it. Third phase is learning, and the 4th phase is indeed seeing if you actually learned what you intended to learn. And now I actually wanted to skip ahead a little bit to shortly explain a bit about my bachelor thesis before I'm going to tell you about my first observations. Because as I said, for my bachelor's thesis, I'm looking at the self-directed learning process in Atlas, and specifically in how the PDP and SER cycle support this. Looking at the PDP and SER cycle, you can call it a PDP practice. And an effective PDP practice consists of several factors. And these are main contextual supporting conditions or individual supporting conditions. So personal development plans and self-evaluation reports are tools to support the self-directed learning and to support a student in doing so effectively. And there are several factors that are part of this. Of course, you first got the PDP, MT, and SER cycle, which is essential. Then you've got the influence of an academic advisor or a motivating supervisor, as it's named in the literature. And then you also got the instruction and feedback given on the PDP and SER and the whole cycle. And the instruction and feedback support the learning and reflection that the student themselves do in this process. And now I'll explain my first observation specifically on the self-directed learning part of the students. I've interviewed 15 Atlas students and asked some questions about the self-directed learning and how they use the PDP and SER and all that stuff. So starting with identifying the learning needs. Because we're kind of in time pressure, I'm not going to go through all the observations because that took too much time when I practiced it. So I'll just point out the most relevant ones. So first of all, when identifying the learning needs, there are two things that are very present and prominent in figuring out what the next steps are of a student, which is the desired academic profile. So what kind of new engineer people want to be and what they want to achieve, and the preferred masters they would want to start. And oftentimes they look at the requirements of the masters in this case. And this is mostly led by the interest of the students themselves. Then formulating learning goals. I think here already in Atlas we kind of deviate from the theoretical framework. And students have the feeling that they do not have enough freedom to formulate their own learning goals because the semester goals are pretty much given to them and they're just using those to argue what they're going to do in their PDP and in their semester. Then additionally, I also noticed that some students choose their courses first before they actually formulate their own learning goals, which is slightly different than the process of self-directed learning suggests. Then moving on to identifying human and material resources. Looking at the students I interviewed, the first thing that became obvious is that students don't really consider any other resources outside of the courses that are given at the UT or online courses they can follow. Which means that this process is done, they identify the resource, the material resources, but they don't look further than that. And as a result of this, they pretty much just use Osiris and an Atlas elective page to figure out what course they would like to take. Then step 4, choosing the appropriate learning strategies. I think this is a very interesting observation I made, is that the students in Atlas don't really actively consider what learning strategies they're going to use. What most students do, they learned in high school, that worked, they managed to get here, and they just continue doing the same as they did before. Then moving on to 5, the planning. What is interesting here to me is that when they're planning, there's one assumption that the students make. In their PDP, they choose their courses, they explain their courses, why they're doing it, and then from that moment onwards, they let go of their PDP, MT, and SER, and they just assume that if they complete the courses, if they pass the courses, that it should all be fine and they will achieve their goals. Then step 6, implementing the learning strategies. Because in step 4, choosing the appropriate learning strategies, there's not much conscious thought given about what strategies they're doing. This is pretty much just working on their courses and doing the stuff they need to do in the way they're used to doing it, so there's not much deviation here. And then moving on to monitoring. Most students do not actively monitor their progress in light of their learning goals throughout the semester. They do, however, keep track of their courses. They're looking if they are passing their courses, if they're on track for passing their courses, but they never really give a second thought about the semester goals throughout the semester. And then evaluating the learning outcomes. Usually the SER here is mentioned and is quite prevalent. And there are a few things about the SER here. First of all, there are 2 parts currently present in the SER. You've got the soft part, which is the reflection side, like how they experience the semester, how they experience their own personal development. And students often find this more valuable than the hard part, which is the evaluation, which is presenting the results, seeing if they passed their goals or not, and they oftentimes consider that very repetitive. Additionally, what they also said here is that writing a strong PDP makes writing your SCR much simpler, because if you write a strong PDP, you've got a good argumentation. You oftentimes can just say, yes, I did this, or I did not do this, therefore I did pass the goal or did not pass the goal. And then I surely wanted to also give some observations about the other points in the PDP and SCR practice that I observed. And that is, first and foremost, that the PDP, MT, and SCR cycle seem to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. They remind people of the self-directed learning process. They help people actively think about it, yet it seems that it's not an optimal form yet. Then secondly, the academic advisors, mentors. In some cases, they are absolutely excellent, provide a lot of support, and help the students in their whole process and journey. In other cases, students haven't talked to them for ages, don't even want to talk to them because they don't consider them useful in their development. And then the instruction and feedback. The instruction has been improving over the past few years, and students appreciate it a lot. Especially Pascal's reflection guide was mentioned quite some time, that it was very useful. But the feedback, almost similar to the academic advisors, was either very good or very bad. And those were my first observations. So if there are any questions, feel free to shoot.